From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Thomas Mallon works in a number of genres. He's a nonfiction writer. He's written acclaimed books on the diary form, on the lost art of letter writing, on plagiarism, that ever topical subject, and also on the art of the essay. One of Mr. Mallon's own essays, written in 2006 for the New Yorker magazine, I think is still giving him a lot of agita, as we say in Italian. He wrote an essay on Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, and Mr. Mallon's approach to it was to examine how To Kill a Mockingbird is being taught to the nation's school children as moral Ritalin. So you can imagine the mail he received on that. The contrariness, the humor, and the intelligence that mark Thomas Mallon's essays also infuse his novels. He's written 9 historical novels, some of them dealing with, among other subjects, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, the election, the 1949 election, Truman versus Dewey, and then, of course, his latest novel, Watergate. One of the things that I do admire about this latest novel is that Thomas Mallon focuses on some key characters in the Watergate scandal who usually don't get enough attention, especially the women involved, Rosemary Woods, and also Alice Longworth Roosevelt. Mr. Mallon will be signing books from 4 to 5 after the reading. It's my great pleasure to turn the podium over to Thomas Mallon.
Okay. Thank you, Maureen. It's very nice to be here again. It's nice to be here when it's not 110 degrees, which it was the last time I was here. This is sort of heavenly. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how I came to write this novel, and then we'll be delighted to take questions at a certain point. How I got around to writing this. I think it all starts in 1960, when I was 9 years old and in the 4th grade, the son of a very Republican household, and I went to school every day wearing a Nixon Lodge Experience Counts button. I used to tell my fellow 9-year-olds that John F. Kennedy didn't have enough experience to be president of the United States, which is a very thoughtful, out there position, I think, for a 9-year-old to have taken. But my first real significant political memory was election night, 1960, when I went into the kitchen to talk to my father and asked him if Nixon was really going to lose, which appeared likely at that point, and he said, "I think so." And I was sort of stricken by this, and Nixon stuck with me. To some extent, he got deeper into my bones than John F. Kennedy did, which is a peculiar thing. We were Irish Catholics, but we were not, certainly my father's generation, the town was full of Irish Catholics, didn't really identify with John Kennedy. They didn't look at him and say, here's my chance to vote for a fellow Irish Catholic and put him in the White House. They looked at JFK and they saw a fellow who'd gone to Harvard. They saw a fellow whose father had gone to Harvard. When they looked at Richard Nixon, they saw themselves. They saw somebody sort of struggling, striving. He looked like somebody was going to night school to pick up that certificate in accounting. Maybe they could get their wives a fur coat instead of a cloth coat someday if they kept at it. And they became, I think, a generation before we had the phenomenon of the Reagan Democrats, they became the Nixon Democrats in some ways. One thing I think people forget, because Nixon was such an awkward, maladroit, tormented figure, really, to a great degree, was that there were a lot of people who were personally enthusiastic about him. He wasn't just the default conservative candidate or whatever. Nixon did have a personal and surprisingly passionate following. And a lot of that, I think, consisted of people like my dad. I grew up very, very intrigued and fascinated by Nixon throughout the years of his comeback. I shook his hand, and Mrs. Nixon's in 1968. They came through my town. By that time, I was 17. And Nixon stood up on the back of the car and gave a speech. And Mrs. Nixon, I remember, was sitting on the top of the back seat. And how this was allowed to happen 6 months after Bobby Kennedy's assassination, Martin Luther King's assassination, is sort of beyond me. But he did come through town. It was very friendly political territory in this open car. And I do remember Mrs. Nixon's very spiky heels digging into the red leather upholstery of the Lincoln that she was riding in. And when I think about this image years later, the spiky heels and the red leather, whatever, it somehow, I think, seemed to suggest hidden depths about Mrs. Nixon to me, and I think they stuck with me and stayed with me even in the writing of this book, which I'll get to in a bit. I think as a writer, I always knew I would get around to him. He had been the president for my entire time in college, those tumultuous years. When I was a freshman, we had the invasion of Cambodia, the Kent State killings. The Paris Peace Accords were signed when I was a senior. Nixon ended the draft the month I graduated. We were all very, very grateful, but not about to credit him with any of that. I followed him really all through his post-presidency, which in many ways was much more exemplary than his presidency. In some respects, he was a model ex-president. He wrote serious books, he gave serious speeches, didn't take fees for them, advised every president who came after him up through Bill Clinton. There was, in some ways, I think, a kind of penitential aspect to him in those last 20 years. I remember the night that he died in 1994, a year after Mrs. Nixon had died. I remember when the news came over the television, really crumpling up and sobbing. And I could not have told you what my emotions were. Richard Nixon was a man who had let me, along with the rest of the country, down many, many times. But I also knew he was a man of great gifts, was a man who was of great sorrows and disappointments. Complicated doesn't begin to describe it. I think until I spent 3 years with him working on this book, I never really understood Robert Caro, who I gather is around here today. I never understood how he could spend year after year, decade after decade with Lyndon Johnson. I sort of got it after 3 years with Nixon. I think I could have spent a few more years with him and not felt I was getting to the bottom of things. And I think one of the things that a novelist learns to do is to take a hint from moments like that, a moment when you're sobbing and don't quite know why and can't sort out this complexity of feelings about this man who was around the public scene for your entire life. I think a novelist learns to go with that. Well, what are those feelings? Let's try to sort them out, run with them, and see if you can make a book that is ambivalent about this figure. I had no interest in writing a novel in which Nixon was just a kind of mustache-twirling, two-dimensional villain. I thought if I was going to write a book about him, it had to be all sides of him. And this is the book that came for me. It was a novel. Nixon had appeared almost as a cameo figure in a number of my books previous. I guess I always knew I would get around to him in a fuller way. I remember about 15 years ago, the editor, James Atlas in New York, took me to lunch one day, and he was putting together a series of short biographies for Viking Penguin. And he asked me if I would like to write one about Lincoln. I had just written a novel called Henry and Clara, which was about the couple in the balcony with the Lincolns on the night of the assassination. And he said, how about doing Lincoln for the series? And I begged off because I didn't think I could add much to the voluminous Lincoln material. I mean, if you go down to the new Education Center at Ford's Theater, you can see that there's a stack of Lincoln books that rises literally to the sky. And I thought, I don't want to just synthesize everything that's been done before. But I remember at the end of the lunch saying to him, but you know what, Jim, don't ever give away Nixon without at least calling me. I don't even know if they did Nixon in the series. but I certainly didn't do it. It would be 15 more years before I came to write this novel. I live right here in Washington. I live in Foggy Bottom, and I live directly across the street from the Watergate. You look out on it from my study window. So it's been on my mind ever since I came to live here in 2003. And I remember one evening very vividly when I was coming back from my office at George Washington University, only a few blocks away, looking at it and thinking, I'm going to write a novel about Watergate. And thus did my Nixon book finally appear to me. Nixon's only a part of it. Every president is only, in some ways, a small part of his own administration. But he's one of 7 characters through whom I tell this story. And I should stress that even though this is historical fiction, it's not what is sometimes called alternate history fiction, that subgenre of historical fiction in which, you know what happens, the South wins the Civil War, things like that happen, where you actually change the big narrative. I don't change the main historical timeline. Nixon still resigns. He still fires Archibald Cox or gets somebody to fire him. All of those big events still take place. But one thing I think that historical fiction can do is take those events, what the late Gore Vidal used to call the agreed upon facts, and insert between them things that might have happened as well, and things that the protagonist and the other characters of the story might have been motivated by, might have been thinking, might have been feeling. A biographer of Richard Nixon always has to engage in that kind of qualification that biographers do and say things like, well, it's not unreasonable to suppose that at this point Nixon may have thought, ... whereas the novelist just has him think it, just has him say it. And in most cases, it's not nearly as improbable as some of the things you actually hear on the White House tapes. So that, I think, I always make modest claims for historical fiction as a genre. I've written somewhere that it's important to remember that nouns always trump adjectives. And in historical fiction, the noun is fiction. It is fiction. And I always get a little nervous when people say to me, oh, I learned so much history from your books. I always sort of want to say, be careful, because by the time I'm through, I'm not entirely certain what I made up and what I researched. But I mentioned these 7 characters. Nixon is one of them. And I just thought I would mention who they were and what I hoped they might add to the story of Watergate and our understanding of it. Like most big writers of most big novels, I felt I needed, big historical novels, I felt I needed a chorus figure. And I found my one-woman witches chorus in the person of Alice Roosevelt Longworth, who was on the verge of her 90th birthday at the time of the Watergate scandal. She was Teddy Roosevelt's daughter. She had been in Washington for 70 years. She had arrived in town in 1901 when her father, Teddy Roosevelt, became president upon the assassination of McKinley. Whenever she was asked by biographers, what was your reaction when you heard the news about President McKinley, she always said, I danced a jig. She wanted to be the president's daughter. She caused Teddy Roosevelt no end of trouble. He said that he could either run the country or control Alice, but not both. So he opted for the former. And Alice was married in the White House. Take any presidential child that you have lived through, from John and Caroline up through Sasha and Malia. And there was none of them as famous as Alice. She was tremendous copy for reporters while she was in the White House. And she loved the limelight. She was very sharp-tongued, very witty. She was known for being the woman who said that Calvin Coolidge looked as if he had been weaned on a pickle. She didn't really say it, but it was always attributed to her that she had said that Thomas E. Dewey looked like the little man on top of the wedding cake. In that house in DuPont Circle, she had a pillow on one of the sofas that said, if you can't say something nice about somebody, come sit by me. She also was married to the Speaker of the House, Nicholas Longworth, for whom the Longworth Building here on Capitol Hill is named, but it was an open secret in Washington that she had had a long, long affair with Senator William Borah of Idaho. And she had a daughter by Borah, and everybody who was at all close to their circles knew that the child was really Borah's and not Nick Longworth's. But Nick Longworth was very forbearing, and the only place he supposedly drew the line was when Alice wanted to name the girl Deborah, Borah, of Borah, and he thought that was a bit much. She was a terrible mother, as she, I think, might admit, but a wonderful grandmother. And when Paulina, the daughter, died tragically as a suicide in the 1950s, it fell to Alice to raise the granddaughter. And people were horrified at the thought that this terrible upbringing of the daughter, who was eventually called Paulina, would repeat itself with the granddaughter. But Alice turned out to be this kind of fabulous Auntie Mame grandmother. And she did a very good job of raising the grandchild. She knew Richard Nixon from the time he arrived in Washington in the late 40s. Alice was very right-wing. She had remained active in Republican politics, and she was a good spotter of political horseflesh. And she marked Nixon as a comer from the time that she got here, or that he got here. And she was friendly with the whole family. She liked Mrs. Nixon. She saw quite a lot of them while he was president. She was in and out of the White House quite a bit. Every time she had a birthday, the Washington Post would profile her and try to get her to say something about Nixon that might be a match for the things she had said about Coolidge and Dewey and everyone else. And she would refuse to take the bait, and she would say, no, I like him, like the whole family. You won't get me to say a word against them, like them all. And then she'd say, except for Tricia, what's wrong with her? Nixon went to her 90th birthday party. It's a scene in the book. She turns 90 about 6 months before he has to resign. He goes with Mrs. Nixon to her mansion in DuPont Circle. And when he's coming out of the house, the reporters come up to him and they say, you know, what do you think Mrs. Longworth's secret to a long life is? And he says, in effect, he says, well, it's because she doesn't get obsessed by the petty things that we all get obsessed with here in Washington. And of course, what he's saying is we're all wallowing in this current scandal too much. But she likes ideas. She likes big things. So a reporter later went back to her with this remark and said, is that true that you don't get obsessed with the petty things? And she said, you mean Watergate? She says, can't get enough of it. And on a notepad she was keeping at the time when when the sands in the hourglass were beginning to run out, she makes a note and she says, I think the clock is dicking. She was my chorus figure. She had a long historical memory. She knew everybody. And so she was perfect for this novel. If you are old enough to remember Watergate, you probably remember Martha Mitchell, the wife of the Attorney General. And Mrs. Mitchell was very flamboyant, very quotable, but not as reliable as Alice, I think, as a chorus figure. Martha was, for all the fun that people had with her, was a tragic figure in a lot of ways, very deeply alcoholic, very troubled, and was absent from Washington for most of the scandal. The Mitchells, who lived in the Watergate, as did many members of the Nixon administration, some of them are still there. You can, it was a young hotshots address in the early 70s. You can now still see them toddling into the CVS to get their prescriptions 40 years later. But the Mitchells had been there. Rosemary Woods, the president's secretary, who's one of these 7 characters, she lived in the Watergate. She lived in Watergate West. And she interested me a lot. Rosemary Woods was a single woman, tough woman, a lot of fun by people's accounts, a tremendous dancer, and goodness knows loyal to Richard Nixon, the man she had worked with for 22 years. And she was drawn into the scandal, of course, with the tape, the missing 18 and a half minutes. Did she manage to cause that inadvertently, purposely, whatever? I attempt as a novelist to offer an explanation for what happened in the book. Unless you are a real Watergate buff or fanatic, you probably don't know the name Fred LaRue, who was a man from Mississippi who worked in the Nixon White House, did a lot of work for John Mitchell. shadowy figure, very soft-spoken. He had no business card. He did not appear in the White House directory, but he did a lot of things for the administration, and it fell to him to coordinate the payments of hush money to the burglars. And that was how he became enmeshed in the scandal and ultimately went to jail. He also had tragedy in his early life. He had killed his father in a hunting accident when he was a young man, and this shadowed the rest of his life. And I somehow attempt to bring these two events together, again, as a novelist and not a historian in the book. The only one of the characters in the book whom I actually knew was Howard Hunt. Howard Hunt was a CIA agent whose career had come to grief over the Bay of Pigs. He was on the side a spy novelist. He wrote a lot of pulpy thrillers. And he, after early retirement from the CIA, came to work in the Nixon White House as one of the plumbers, the president's little espionage group within the White House. He was recruited by his fellow Brown graduate, Charles Colson. And I met Hunt. As a Brown man myself, I met him at a Brown event one time about 20 years ago, talked to him. I was an editor in those days, and he wrote a magazine piece for me. And he was a tormented, again, that word that applies to Nixon as well, in some ways dark figure, very compelling, very unreconstructed, politically way out. Take your eye as far as you can see to the right. But a man of some emotions and a great deal of personal sorrow, too. And I try to imagine the toll that this bad deed that he did, series of bad deeds in the Nixon White House, took on him, because he had decades to live after it. Howard didn't die until 2007. And so I tried to see things from his point of view. Elliot Richardson, Richard Nixon's Brahmin wasp, Mr. Clean, his attorney general for 6 months before he fired him for not getting rid of Archibald Cox. He's another of the point of view characters in the book. Richardson was very upright, was indeed an honest man, but was also a very ambitious man. And Richard Nixon in 1973, I think, was one of the few people who realized how much Elliot Richardson already wanted to be president. And if you listen to those tapes, there's a tape of a phone call, Nixon calling Richardson on the night he appoints him Attorney General. It's that same night that he has fired John Ehrlichman, fired Bob Haldeman, fired John Dean, and he's counting on Richardson as the new Attorney General to clean up his administration and save his presidency. So he calls him up. It's late in the evening. I think they've probably both had a couple of cocktails, and Nixon starts talking and says, well, what'd you think of the speech, Elliot? The speech about the firings. And Elliot Richardson, who talked in a very, very Harvard kind of manner, you needed pliers to pry his teeth apart, the upper deck from the lower deck. And he said, oh, I was very moved, Mr. President, very moved by it. And it's very clear while you're listening that he was not moved by the speech, that there were things about Nixon that probably repelled him a great deal. And Nixon clearly wants him to investigate the scandal, to get it behind the administration, but not to investigate it perhaps too aggressively. And he begins, being Nixon, to press his advantage. One of the things he has on his mind is the Alger Hiss case from many years ago in the 1940s. That was what made him so attractive to people like Alice Roosevelt Longworth, and made them spot him as somebody who had a big future in politics. And he says to Richardson on that tape, he says, you know, Elliot, this could take you all the way. And nobody was really thinking of Richardson as a potential president at that point, but Nixon was. And this was the side of Nixon that could process these things very, very quickly. And he immediately tries to press his advantage just a little bit to get him to investigate, but not maybe 100%. And the one thing he says of real substance in that phone call is, you know, Elliot, I'm not sure you need a special prosecutor. And of course, the special prosecutor would turn out to be Archibald Cox, about whom they would come to grief 6 months later during the October Saturday Night Massacre. And Richardson resists. And he says, well, Mr. President, I'm not sure about that. And he's not willing to say, no, I'll do it myself, no special prosecutor. Nixon realizes that he has pushed just a bit too far, and he says, Elliot, you do whatever you want to, you do whatever you think is right, and I'll back you to the hilt. You want to appoint a special prosecutor? You can dig up Charles Evans Hughes if you want. The man who had run against Woodrow Wilson in 1916. They were both very complicated people. Richardson, much more complex, I think, than most people imagined. And the last of these characters, and who I think is really in many ways the heart of the book, is Mrs. Nixon, Pat Nixon, who in some ways I think is among our least understood first ladies. She was made terrible sport of by Nixon's enemies and cartoonists. Her nickname, you may remember, was Plastic Pat. And she just seemed the ultimate political wife, standing in the background while Nixon dragged her through one convulsion after another. Mrs. Nixon was a very strong woman, very pretty woman. She had, by all accounts, a good, sharp sense of humor, very independent. She may have looked to people like a prosperous Republican lawyer's wife, but she was born in a miner's shack in Nevada in 1912. At 18, she had earned money by driving an elderly couple across the country from Southern California to New York, where she remained for a couple of years working in a tuberculosis hospital. She earned extra money for USC as an extra in the movies. She is in the dancing scene, to some people's eyes. I've never been able to spot her, in the movie Becky Sharp, the first Technicolor movie that was ever made in Hollywood in 1935. And she did not like politics. She was very devoted to her husband and supported him, I think, with great regret when he got back into politics in 1968. By most accounts, her happiest years were probably the 5 or so years that the Nixons lived in New York, from 1963 to 68. Between his defeats to John F. Kennedy and then to Pat Brown for the governorship of California, and then his ultimate triumph in 68, she was in New York. They lived on Fifth Avenue. She went to Elizabeth Arden. She went to bookshops. She went to museums. Her girls were in school. Nobody interviewed her. She was at that point the wife of a prominent Republican lawyer, and it was the quiet life that I think would have suited her much more than the life that she had. But in 1968, she suited up in her armor again, hid her cigarette smoking from the photographers and the public, and stuck with Richard Nixon to the end. She's unknown to us because once they left Washington, she never gave another interview. She never wrote her own memoirs. I think by the early 90s, she was the sort of person that would appear in, Dead or Alive quizzes. She was sort of reclusive. If you've ever seen a picture of Nixon at her funeral, which was only a year before his own, you will see a side of Richard Nixon that you may never have seen before. He is racked with sobs at one point and absolutely loses his composure. And you wonder what was on his mind about all the things that she had endured with him. Just a couple of last words about historical fiction before I take some questions. As I say, I think Mrs. Nixon is the emotional heart of this book. But I did do one of the things in this book that historical novelists do, which is make things up. And I imagine that in those years in New York, there was something that completed her happiness. And I imagine in the book that she has a very brief, tender affair with a retired lawyer, a fictitious character named Tom Garahan in the book. An affair she gives up out of devotion to her husband and because the 68 campaign is about to get underway. But she remains very, very occasionally in touch with Tom Garahan. And I felt when I wrote those scenes, which made some reviewers queasy. Reviewers, Maureen Corrigan included, were very, very generous to this book. But this is one of the things that rattles people with historical fiction. And at what point does the historical novelist license run out? What are you allowed to do? Not in a legal sense. Mrs. Nixon is long gone. There's no legal question here. But in an ethical sense, in an imaginative sense. But I can tell you very honestly that when I wrote those scenes involving Mrs. Nixon and Tom Garahan, who didn't really exist, I felt that I was somehow getting to the bigger truths about Mrs. Nixon, to the way her mind operated, to the way she talked, to what her emotions really were. And I think that's one of the paradoxes of all novel writing, not just historical novel writing. You try to get at some kind of essential truth via small, particular lies. And if historical fiction can do anything to supplement regular history, and I would reiterate that it should always be read with care, I do think that's one of the things it can do. It can imagine these what-ifs. Not what if instead, but what if in addition to this had happened. And I felt that that was the place, and she was the character who provided the biggest opportunities for a novelist, this unknown and very poignant figure who people, I think, as the years go by, insofar as they remember her at all, remember her fondly and with a certain wistfulness. So those 7 people carry the book, or fail to carry the book, but they are the conveyors of the story. And one of the things I've learned being out promoting this book, it's very easy to get a discussion of Richard Nixon started. If you say, does anyone have any questions, and nobody raises his hand, what I've learned to say is, does anybody here have an opinion about Richard Nixon? And that generally gets things going. So let me just ask it more simply. Does anyone have a question? We've got microphones here and there. And I see somebody coming up.
Hi. This is not about Richard Nixon, so that discussion can get started later. You've written on a really broad range of topics, both fiction and nonfiction, and I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about your research process and if it's different for your nonfiction than it is for your fiction.
Sure. It's got to be more careful with nonfiction than fiction. It has to be more scrupulous. I mean, the research sort of suggests things to you when you're writing historical fiction, but I do try to immerse myself in the subject. Watergate's one of the few subjects I've written about where I wished there were less in the way of material. There is so much. Committee transcripts, videotapes of the hearings, the matchless White House tapes, memoirs. Virtually everybody who was involved in it wrote a memoir, if only to pay his legal bills. So I try to soak myself in it, but 2 things. One is to make sure that I start writing before I've read everything, because you can never read everything. And if you don't get started while you're still researching, you'll never start. And the other thing I think that's a good rule of thumb for writers of historical fiction is read less about the period. In other words, read less that historians have written about the period than you read from the period. Read the books that were actually written during that time. Read the letters that people wrote. Read the newspapers more than the history, because that's what will teach you how people actually spoke, how they actually thought. You sort of eliminate the middleman in a way, to some extent. Okay? Thank you. This gentleman and then this lady. Yeah.
First of all, a big fan of Aurora 7.
Thank you.
That book and this book have in common the fact that you basically were alive in the periods of history that you were writing about. You may have already indirectly answered this question, but how do you shake loose of the inhibitions of dealing with a period of history that you yourself lived in and free yourself to speculate about those things that, after all, you had some awareness of or some perception of? How does the novelist in you, shake off those inhibitions and reluctance to deal with those things?
Yeah, the gentleman's referring to an old novel of mine called Aurora 7, which was set on the day of one of the first space flights. Aurora 7 was Scott Carpenter's flight about 3 months after John Glenn's, and I was mad for Project Mercury. I was 10 at the time. But I have written a lot about periods that I lived through very young. And I think, including Watergate. I mean, as I say, I was in college and graduate school when it was unfolding. And one thing I was very aware of while researching this book was how much and how quickly things came back to me. I'm writing now about Washington in the late 1980s. And at that time, I was in my late 30s. In some ways, it seems more distant to me than the Nixon years do. I mean, I could, at the drop of a hat tell you who was in Richard Nixon's cabinet, but who was Ronald Reagan's Secretary of Agriculture? I mean, I would have to look it up. He might have had to look it up. But a totally different experience to go from Nixon to, the affable Ronald Reagan. But I think it has something to do with how it implants itself on you. And to tell you the truth, though, far from kind of trying to shake it off, I think what I've mostly tried to concentrate on was remembering what it felt like. And I remember sensing, as a very young kid, when Nixon was out of office, I remember sensing that awkwardness in him. I remember one fast story. He appeared on the Jack Paar program early in 1963 when he was at his absolute lowest point politically. He had just lost the governorship of California, and they had just moved to New York. And he came out, and Paar interviewed him, and it was a genial, pleasant interview. And then Nixon sat down at the piano, and he played a composition that he had written himself. And this sort of sugary classical piece. And he got up, and people applauded. And I remembered the last shot as he was going off, before they broke for the commercial. The camera went to Jack Paar, and Jack Paar went to the audience. And Jack Paar's daughter, who recently died, was friendly with the Nixon girls. They went to school together. Jack Paar went to the audience in a way that Nixon couldn't see. It was like, come on, a little more. It was like, the guy's down on his luck. Let's have a little more applause. And I remember at the age of about 11, 10 or 11 at that time, sort of cringing and thinking, God, it's the Vice President of the United States, and it's got to come on, let's take a little bit of social pity on him and give him some applause. And so as I say, sometimes I try to recall what I felt like.
You get more personal rather than less personal, I think.
I actually think so, when it comes to novel writing. Maybe not so much with straight history. Okay, thank you. And this lady here?
Yes, just two quick questions. One, with regard to Mrs. Nixon and kind of assigning that affair to her, I just kind of wondered, what you think about kind of, I don't know if the right word is ethics of that, but, I think it's hard for people sometimes to distinguish in a novel like yours as to what did and did not actually happen. And so, even though she's long since dead, her family members are still alive. And I think that there's a sense of confusion that people will have as to whether that's something that actually happened. And I wondered how you felt about that. And then my second question was just with regard to, you seem like you have a lot of sympathy towards Nixon, and you explained how you were kind of, as a result of your family, an early supporter or fan of his, and then I think you had some realism about him. But I was just wondering about how you felt when some of the more recent tapes were
It's a very good
revealed,
question.
and kind of the the paranoia that was displayed, and then also kind of some of the ethnic antipathy that he had, etc. So, thank you.
The first one about the distinguishing between what is and what isn't. I do think genres need to be clearly labeled. I mean, when you sign on to read a novel, you have to remember that it is fiction and not history. Same with memoirs versus novels. A lot of the literary memoirs that have come out in the last 20 years turn out to be rather highly fictionalized at times, even though they're being put before the reader as a memoir. The labeling, I think, is important. Anybody who's read this book recognizes the portrait of Mrs. Nixon as very sympathetic, very warm, whatever. I didn't think this was a terrible offense. I was giving to her. I didn't, on the scale of iniquity, I thought this was a tender, very human flaw. I was trying to humanize her in some ways. But I do think that you have to give the novelist the license to invent, but the novelist's responsibility is to make clear that this is invention. And the other question is, there are things that I continue to admire about Richard Nixon. There are things that make me cringe. And the tapes, every time a new batch of them is released, I think almost everybody who admires Richard Nixon cringes at the things he says. You mentioned ethnic remarks, the profanity. One of the things I hear on those tapes this is not to forgive it in him, but it's to try to understand it somewhat, is I can hear on those tapes this man who worshipped toughness, and he thought that the cruder and the rougher and the more locker room he could sound at times, that was a sign that he was one of the big boys and he was nobody's fool and nobody was going to take advantage of him. And so here you have this man who actually was very sensitive in many respects and distorting himself to sound ugly, deliberately. It's the worst side of him, and the paradox is that when he's doing it, he's actually at his weakest, and he's actually giving materials through which history will permanently shade his image. And so I think, again, I mentioned Robert Caro. I think Robert Caro has not so much on tape, although Johnson left behind some tapes too, has to deal with some of these same things. And finally, those figures become the ones you most want to write about, though. You don't want plaster saints, and you don't want villains tying heroines to the railroad tracks. It's these complicated people in between. The lady down front says 2 minutes, so one more question, this gentleman?
Well, I just wonder if you had some thoughts about what the plumbers were looking for when they broke into the Democratic headquarters at the Watergate.
It remains one of the enduring mysteries. What were they actually looking for, and who actually sent them in? Bugging the Democratic National Headquarters. If you were Mitt Romney's campaign manager at the moment, experiencing considerable difficulties in some ways, would you be thinking, we can turn this around if only we can get inside Debbie Wasserman Schultz's desk? That's where it all is. It's got to be there. A mystery to me. There are many specific theories that they wanted to find out what connections Larry O'Brien had to Howard Hughes, that they wanted to see if rumors that Fidel Castro had been funneling money to the Democratic Party might be true. There's a whole kind of grassy knoll theory of Watergate, which posits that John Dean sent them in there because he wanted something retrieved that was important in his personal life. Actually, I don't know, and most Watergate scholars, and I don't purport to be one, don't really know either what the answer is. But as early as February of 1972, when Gordon Liddy is making that mad presentation in John Mitchell's office in the Justice Department, the DNC was mentioned as a possible target of espionage. But one thing Richard Nixon detested was stupidity. And you can imagine what he thought of that in later years, that was what would bring him down. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.